Even before Russian tanks entered Ukrainian soil, the Kremlin launched a large-scale campaign to destroy Ukraine. Disinformation aimed at sowing doubt, fear, and despair. It was meant to demoralize Ukrainians, influence the international audience, and brainwash its own population, creating an alternative reality in which the war appeared as defense and occupation turned into liberation. In this video, we have gathered evidence to debunk the most common myths that Russia systematically spread through state media, politicians, experts, networks of pro-Russian commentators, and entire troll factories. And it propagated a distorted one, the image of Ukraine, from a failed state to an artificial nation, to claims about inevitable economic collapse and that Europe had no need for it. Let's see what actually happened to these predictions and how they didn't stand up to the facts. Myth 1. Ukraine will collapse without Russia. Without Russia, Ukraine won't survive. It will perish and fall into an abyss. One of the oldest and most persistent myths of Russian propaganda, which has been constantly repeated by Russian and pro-Russian officials and TV channels. This was pushed especially aggressively in 2013, when Ukraine was getting close to signing an association agreement with the European Union. At that time, Russian President Vladimir Putin and representatives of the Russian government openly stated that after signing the agreement with the EU, Ukraine would lose access to the Russian customs union. We will be forced to protect our economy, because we cannot leave the open gates within the free trade zone with Ukraine in such a state if it opens its gates toward the European Union, and we will be forced to close it. They were literally painting apocalyptic scenarios for Ukraine: closure of enterprises, mass unemployment, and economic collapse. A prominent figure, Putin's advisor on regional economic integration issues, Serhiy Glazyev, who believed that Ukraine was violating the friendship treaty with the Russian Federation. At the Yalta Forum, he warned that signing the agreement with the EU would make default in Ukraine inevitable, leading to a decline in living standards, chaos, and political and social unrest. And Russia would no longer be able to guarantee Ukrainian statehood.
The signing of Ukraine's association agreement with the European Union will seriously, irreversibly, and for a long time worsen our trade and economic relations. Period. This was stated at the meeting of the two prime ministers. Was this considered blackmail? Yes. Why blackmail? We're just warning. Hold on, colleagues. We are warning.
He directly said pursuing a European course was suicide, and the losses from association with the EU to overcome default would reach 35 billion euros. It was real blackmail, either Europe or the Russian Federation. It was under Glazyev's leadership in the summer of 2013 that Russia actually conducted a trade rehearsal for future economic pressure, when Russian customs began massively blocking Ukrainian goods at the border. The representative of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Oleksandr Lukashevich, who was then the head of the Department of Information and Press, made a statement. According to independent experts, the economic effect of implementing the agreement will be negative until 2020, and the manna from heaven in the form of an influx of investments, technologies, and so on, which Kyiv and the European Union promise in the long term, is not guaranteed by concrete commitments. The logic of the Kremlin was based on a real but deliberately exaggerated dependence. Until 2014, Russia was indeed one of Ukraine's key trading partners. According to consolidated statistics, in 2012, Russia accounted for about 25.7% of Ukrainian exports and 32.4% of investments. At that time, about 25% of Ukrainian exports and almost 31% of imports went to EU countries. In other words, the two main trade destinations were actually equivalent. But considering that the total trade volume with the Russian Federation at that time was over $12.5 billion, Russian propaganda made a false conclusion. If dependence exists, then it is eternal. If the Russian market is important, then without it, the Ukrainian economy is doomed. Reality showed otherwise. After 2014, Ukraine really experienced an economic shock. War, the occupation of Crimea, fighting in Donbass, the breaking of production chains, trade restrictions from the Russian Federation, the devaluation of the hryvnia, and a drop in GDP. But this was not proof of Ukraine's incapacity. It was not about being unable to live without Russia, but rather the price of Russian aggression and the forced restructuring of the economy. And it was during this restructuring that the myth began to fall apart. Friends, we have an ambitious goal to reach 200,000 subscribers on the channel by the end of 2026. You might be watching us for a long time and not even realize that you haven't subscribed. Subscribe to our channel and tell others about it. To your relatives and friends, also give us a like and leave a comment under this video. We thank all the donors, patrons, and sponsors on YouTube. Every hryvnia you donate brings Ukraine closer to economic prosperity and well-being. Because we are not just making videos, we are enlightening voters who will choose real reformers. Help us with this. The link to support the price of the state is in the description. First fact: the Ukrainian market did not turn out to be irreplaceable. Even after 2014, Russia's share in Ukrainian trade sharply decreased. The EU came out ahead and became the main avenue for economic integration. In 2017, Ukrainian exports to Russia accounted for only about 9%, while exports to the European Union were about 40%. That is, in just a few years, Ukraine went from models that Moscow could blackmail with access to its market to models where the main direction of trade became the European Union. This did not mean an easy or painless transition. Many enterprises lost their usual customers, changed their logistics, and went through European certification. But gradually, a process took place that Russian propaganda considered impossible. Instead of collapse, there was diversification. The second fact: integration with the EU did not destroy Ukrainian exports, but gradually became their new foundation. The deep and comprehensive free trade area between Ukraine and the EU began to be provisionally applied on January 1, 2016, and the broader association agreement fully entered into force on September 1, 2017. Today, the European Union is Ukraine's largest trading partner. According to the European Commission, in 2025, about 65. Of all of Ukraine's goods trade, the total trade turnover between Ukraine and the EU exceeded 68 billion euros, and more than doubled compared to the period before the launch of the deep and comprehensive free trade area in 2016. Russia promised Ukraine economic isolation, but in reality, Ukraine has become increasingly integrated into Europe's largest market. Third, the geography of Ukrainian exports has also changed. In 2013, Russia was still one of Ukraine's key partners. But in the following years, there was a gradual shift in foreign trade towards the EU, Poland, China, Turkey, and other countries. As of 2021, the structure of partners is fundamentally different from the previous model of dependence on Russia. This is exactly what Moscow was trying to prevent. Ukraine not only lost Russia, but also began to develop its own trade geography, reducing the political risk inherent in dependence on a single aggressive partner. Fourth fact: it wasn't just raw material exporters who adapted. Yes, the agricultural sector became the most visible beneficiary of the reorientation. Grains, oilseeds, sunflower oil, food products, organic goods, honey, eggs, meat, poultry, sugar, all of these gradually found new sales channels. Notably, in 2024, the European discussion was no longer about whether Ukraine was able to sell anything to the EU. It was about the fact that Ukrainian agricultural products had become so competitive that the EU was forced to regulate certain import flows. We will talk about this in more detail later. It is also important that the European direction forced Ukrainian producers to work with different standards: certification, logistics, quality, traceability of origin, sanitary and phytosanitary requirements and technical regulations. This is exactly what the European Commission describes as one of the goals of launching the deep and comprehensive free trade area: the gradual alignment of Ukrainian regulations with EU standards in the industrial and agricultural sectors. This is neither a quick nor a cheap process, but this is exactly how the economy moved away from post-Soviet dependence. Not through the slogan, "We no longer trade with Russia," but through the ability to sell where stricter rules apply, higher competition, and greater quality requirements. The Russian myth was most strongly disproved by Russia's own actions. If the Ukrainian economy were truly doomed without the Russian Federation, the Kremlin wouldn't have needed to threaten with tariffs, launch customs blockades, or start the infamous chocolate wars and cheese wars. By the way, we talked about them in the video, how the Russian Federation destroyed Ukraine economically, the history of the war. Since 1990, Russia put pressure exactly because it understood that Ukraine's economic dependence on the Russian market was political leverage, and this leverage could disappear. In 2013, Moscow tried to sell dependence as economic rationality. Stay with us, or else you're finished. After 2014, it became clear that this wasn't rationality, but a trap. Ukraine didn't collapse. It reduced trade with Russia, reoriented its exports, increased the role of the EU, changed logistics, and began adapting production to European standards, entering new markets. Myth 2. Ukraine can't survive without Russian gas. The next Russian myth concerns energy, which was built on a psychology of dependence. Ukraine won't be able to live without Russian gas. People will freeze, transit will collapse, and the economy will crash. Moscow tried to convince Ukrainians and Europeans that Ukraine's dependence on Russian gas was natural, inevitable, and eternal. In reality, this dependence was artificially created and maintained through blackmail, corrupt agreements, and then used as a tool of influence. Every gas crisis was accompanied not only by economic pressure, but also by a large-scale information campaign. During the 2008-2009 conflict, the head of Gazprom, Alexei Miller, claimed that Ukraine allegedly stole 65.3 million cubic meters of gas and intimidated Ukraine with billion-dollar debts. After that, Vladimir Putin publicly agreed to reduce supplies by the amount of the so-called stolen gas.
All right, I agree with your proposal to suspend supplies, but this needs to be done publicly.
That is, Russia was simultaneously creating the crisis itself and blaming Ukraine for it. After 2014, Russia annexed Crimea and started the war in Donbass. Gazprom again used debts, prepayment, and supply cutoffs as tools of coercion. On November 15, 2015, Gazprom officially announced the suspension of gas supplies to Ukraine due to lack of prepayment. Miller spoke about risks to transit and basically repeated the old scenario of intimidation. And here the Russian myth began to fall apart. Instead of the energy apocalypse that, according to Russian forecasts, was supposed to happen, Ukraine replaced gas imports with supplies from Europe through Slovakia, Poland, and Hungary. And already in the summer of 2015, Naftogaz stopped purchasing from Gazprom, and by the end of the year, completely abandoned direct contracts with Russia. Ukraine not only survived the temporary setback and the refusal of Russian gas, but was also able to exist completely without purchases from Russia. In September 2016, Ukrtransgaz reported 300 days without importing Russian gas for its own needs. That is, the prediction about freezing failed in less than a year after it was made. If Russian dependence were a natural necessity, then any Ukrainian attempt to increase its own production would be of no concern to Moscow. But when Ukraine started talking about shale gas production, the Yuzivska field in Donetsk and Kharkiv regions, and the Oleska field in the west of the country, a campaign of fear immediately emerged around the topic. They will poison the water, destroy the landscapes. There will be earthquakes. It will provoke an increase in cancer cases. This topic was especially actively promoted by pro-Russian forces, among them Medvedchuk, a crony of the Russian president, and his organization Ukrainian Choice, as well as other groups that opposed European integration and supported closer ties with Russia. In 2012, Shell won the right to develop the Uzivska field, and in 2013, Ukraine signed a 50-year production sharing agreement with the company. At the same time, Chevron was entering the Oleska field in western Ukraine. It was estimated that the Uzivska field alone could potentially provide up to 10 billion cubic meters of gas per year, and both projects together could add an additional 11 to 16 billion cubic meters of production per year. 11 to 16 billion cubic meters of production. This is comparable to the volumes of imports that Ukraine later purchased from Europe. That is why the Russian reaction was so nervous. Potentially, Ukraine was getting not just gas, but a means of escaping Gazprom's grip. Ukraine had one of the most promising reserves of unconventional gas in Europe, about 1.2 trillion cubic meters. Technically recoverable resources. If the Shell and Chevron projects succeeded, Ukraine could not only reduce imports, but also fundamentally change the balance of power in the gas market of Eastern Europe. The anti-shale campaign, under the guise of environmental arguments, actually coincided with the interests of maintaining energy dependence on Russia. During the protests against shale gas in Donetsk, Kharkiv, Luhansk, and other cities, provoked by pro-Russian forces, people were fed fears of an environmental disaster. And the political outcome was supposed to be Ukraine's rejection of its own production, rejection of Western investors, and ultimately, rejection of energy independence. Significantly, it was not environmentalists who stopped these projects, but the war, the occupation of part of Donbass, and the sharp increase in security risks for investors. Ukraine, which for years was threatened with an energy death of oblivion. Ukraine not only survived without Russian gas, but also showed that it is possible to import from Europe, reduce consumption, reform Naftogaz, win arbitrations against Gazprom, and develop its own production. The final word in this story is that on January 1, 2025, Ukraine completely stopped the transit of Russian gas through its territory after all contract terms had ended. The Guardian described this as the end of the major Russian gas route to Europe through Ukraine. The entire concept of brotherly gas assistance was just a political noose, and promoting the idea that it was impossible to live without Russian gas turned out to be one of the loudest failures of Russian propaganda. Myth 3. Ukrainian products are not competitive, and the EU will destroy the Ukrainian economy. For trying to break free from the Russian sphere of influence around the association agreement with the EU and the launch of the deep and comprehensive free trade area, the Russian Federation kept selling Ukrainians the same fear. As soon as Ukraine opens its market to the EU, its goods will not be competitive. No one will buy Ukrainian products, and the whole country will turn into a raw material appendage. Today, it is clear. The Kremlin was concerned about the fate of Ukrainian producers. He was frightened by the loss of economic control over Ukraine. Pro-Russian publicists spread disinformation that Ukrainian goods would be uncompetitive compared to European ones. EU quotas and standards will strangle exports. The propaganda had two angles. The EU would supposedly push out Ukrainian producers at home, and Ukrainian producers wouldn't be able to break into Europe. Reality went in the opposite direction. Let's remember that in 2025, the EU was Ukraine's largest trading partner and accounted for about 65% of its goods trade. And the total trade in goods between Ukraine and the EU reached over 68 billion euros. The main Ukrainian goods imported by the EU were not Germany. No one needs the remnants of the Soviet economy, but rather oil, grains, ferrous metals, oilseeds, ores, and other products. Ukrainian exports did not disappear. They changed direction, along with the rules of the game and the main buyer. Russia predicted collapse due to competition, but it turned out that it was actually the European markets that became the main channel for the development of Ukrainian exports after the loss of the Russian market and the beginning of the full-scale invasion. The most ironic blow to the Russian myth is the fact that Europe is battling over Ukrainian products. If Ukrainian goods are not competitive, then why? After the Russian blockade of the Black Sea, when Ukraine redirected part of its agricultural exports through the EU, European farmers protested and demanded restrictions on the import of Ukrainian grain, corn, rapeseed, sunflower, sugar, eggs, meat, poultry, and other goods. In the fall of 2023, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania imposed restrictions on 4 Ukrainian grain crops to prevent oversaturation of their markets and to protect their own producers. In February 2024, Polish farmers even blocked roads and the border with Ukraine. This is not a story about markets. It is not about products nobody needs. This is a story about products that have become so competitive in price and volume that they started to influence the domestic politics of EU countries. Another case. In 2024, the European Commission reinstated tariffs after a sharp increase in supplies from Ukraine. The so-called emergency brake is a safety mechanism for certain Ukrainian goods. Within the framework of autonomous trade measures, import duties, quotas, and trade restrictions for Ukrainian exports were completely suspended. But for sensitive goods like eggs, poultry, sugar, oats, corn, groats, and honey, a mechanism was provided that activates if imports exceed average historical volumes. And that's what happened. By 2023, Ukraine had become the 3rd largest supplier of agri-food products to the EU, providing about 7% of the European Union's imports. In 2024, agricultural trade between Ukraine and the EU reached a historic record of $17 billion. This is the highest figure since the association agreement has existed. This is probably the best counter-argument to the Russian claim. If a product is not competitive, no restrictions are imposed against it. At the same time, we have to be honest. European integration has not made the Ukrainian economy perfect. Ukraine has not gotten rid of its raw material export structure, has not solved all the problems of productivity, and has not switched everywhere to high value-added products. Russia tried to present Ukraine's dependence on its market as a natural state of affairs. But as soon as this dependence began to break down, it turned out that Ukraine gained access to the largest market in the world with about 450 million consumers and gradually integrated into the European economy. After trade with Europe got underway, the problem turned out not to be that Ukraine was unable to compete. On the contrary, in certain sectors, Ukrainian products turned out to be massive enough and competitive enough to change trade balances, trigger European protective mechanisms, and force politicians to negotiate new rules. Russia predicted that Europe would destroy the Ukrainian economy. Reality showed that it was actually access to the European market that helped Ukraine break free from the Russian economic trap. Myth number 4. Ukraine is a totally corrupt state. Russian propaganda tried to sell both the West and Ukrainians the idea that Ukraine is not just a country with a corruption problem, but a totally corrupt, dysfunctional state. That's exactly how, in Russian political discourse after Maidan, Ukraine was constantly branded as a corrupt, failed state. Corruption was presented as the main argument against European integration and international support for Ukraine. In 2023, the National Agency for the Prevention of Corruption, NACP, in its study, Detection and Analysis of Russian Information Threats Related to Corruption in the Ukrainian Media Space, analyzed more than 130,000 informational messages. Posts, articles, and comments in the Ukrainian information space on platforms and social networks such as Twitter, X, Telegram, Facebook, and YouTube. To identify the promotion of the narrative that Ukraine is the most corrupt country in the world. 86 incidents have been recorded. In fact, a new incident occurs every 2 days. 418 sources involved in information operations. 462 sources connected to Russia. 223 bot sources. This is the scale of Russia's information operations against Ukraine. Fabricating fake scandals has become a common tactic. For this, blatantly absurd accusations are spread, primarily aimed at provoking an emotional reaction from the audience. For example, one such fabricated story was about the alleged refusal of American actor Danny Trejo to visit Kyiv because representatives of the president's office supposedly demanded a kickback from his fee. In reality, no such story ever existed. The video was edited from fragments of old interviews with the actor and unrelated footage. Fact-checkers from Ukrinform thoroughly analyzed this operation and determined that it was yet another Russian disinformation hoax aimed at discrediting the Ukrainian authorities and international support for Ukraine. After the full-scale invasion began, this narrative shifted to convincing Western taxpayers that aid to Ukraine would be stolen by its elite. Allegations of large-scale theft became a popular Russian disinformation tactic. To create an account so as not to be held responsible on the black market, it ends up in criminal groups, or is even openly sold in military stores. Or the artificial intelligence network Storm 1516 was spreading fake news about allegedly buying Jag-ED with American aid. Zelensky's villa, million-dollar purchases by Olha Zelenska, and other stories built around the same message. Don't help Ukraine, because all of this will inevitably become loot for the corrupt officials. Russia didn't just use real Ukrainian problems. It added fake evidence to them to turn the fight against corruption into an argument against Ukraine's existence as a successful state. In reality, this doesn't mean that there is no corruption in Ukraine. According to the NACP, more than 72% of Ukrainian citizens in 2025 consider corruption the most serious problem for the country after the full-scale reconstruction. For decades, Ukraine has inherited post-Soviet patronage networks, oligarchic influence, weak courts, political deals, and shadow rents. But the Russian lie is that we have no mechanisms to fight back. Because it was after 2014 that Ukraine began to build what Russia lacks or only has as a facade: an independent anti-corruption infrastructure, electronic declarations, open procurement, a specialized anti-corruption court, public registries, journalistic investigations, digital services, and political pressure from society. In the Transparency International ranking, Ukraine has 36 out of 100 points and is ranked 104th in the world. This is still a weak indicator, but it shows a different dynamic than Russia's black hole narrative, which is for comparison. Russia has 22 points and 157th place out of 100 and 182. That is, the country that has been lecturing Ukraine about corruption for years is itself among the most corrupt countries on the planet. But the main difference between Ukraine and Russia is measured not by ranking numbers, but by the question of accountability. In Ukraine, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine operates, created specifically to investigate top-level corruption. There is also a specialized anti-corruption prosecutor's office. There is a high anti-corruption court. A corruption scandal can cost a high-ranking official their career. A minister can lose their position. A state agency head under investigation may receive a notice of suspicion. By the way, on our channel Tasina Derzavi, there is a detailed video about how the anti-corruption reform progressed in Ukraine. Large-scale corruption in Ukraine. How can we eliminate this evil? One of the most striking examples is the case of the head of the Supreme Court, Vsevolod Knyazev. In May 2023, NABU and SAP caught him taking a bribe of $2.7 million. The very next day, he lost his position. If the head of the highest judicial body in Ukraine can become the subject of an anti-corruption investigation, it doesn't mean the mechanisms are absent, but rather that they are working. One can argue about the duration of investigations or the verdicts, but the very fact that such cases exist is already a precedent. In Russia, it's impossible to imagine an independent investigation into members of Vladimir Putin's inner circle. That's the stuff of fantasy. It's telling that while Ukraine was opening up data about officials' assets through the Unified State Register of Declarations of the NACP, Russia was moving in the opposite direction. In 2023, the Russian authorities passed a law that allowed deputies and senators not to publish their income declarations. And starting from 2026, they canceled them for all officials, making oversight of the elites completely inaccessible to the public. And another fact that destroys the Russian myth about a totally corrupt Ukraine is the digitalization of the state. After the Revolution of Dignity, Ukraine focused not only on creating anti-corruption agencies, but also on maximizing the openness of state data and automating processes. The Prozoro electronic procurement system, built on the principle of everyone sees everything, opened up data for society about participants, proposals, tender committee decisions, and documents. And the web portal spending.gov.ua, launched in 2015, made the use of budget funds much more transparent. That's why the Russian claim that everything will be stolen is a manipulation. In a corrupt, closed system, things are stolen quietly. And in a system with open data, procurements are public because they can be seen, compared, and investigated. Digitalization of public services also has an anti-corruption effect. Through the DIA service, Ukraine has transferred more than 100 government services into digital format. Documents on your smartphone, online services, registrations, certificates, and interaction between citizens and the state without unnecessary contact with officials. The fewer offices, lines, stamps, and fixers there are, the less room there is for everyday corruption. Thanks to the digital transformation of the state, the level of real corruption experienced by the population has significantly decreased. If in 2015, more than 70% of citizens reported personal experience with corruption, then in 2025, this figure dropped to 18.2%. In addition, this provided a powerful tool for public oversight. Journalists gained the ability to systematically check the property and income of officials. In 2025, the NACP conducted more than 240 lifestyle monitoring checks of officials, including those based on journalistic investigations, and uncovered illegal enrichment totaling over 1.1 billion hryvnias. In Ukraine, corruption is a recognized problem and a matter of economic policy. Not all problems have been overcome, but over the past decade, Ukraine has established anti-corruption agencies, whose overall economic impact in the second half of 2025 reached nearly 5 billion hryvnias. This includes returned and confiscated assets, savings on public procurement, and funds directed to support the defense forces. Russia, on the other hand, chooses not to expose but to conceal corruption. Russia chooses to conceal corruption. Opaque government decisions, the lack of independent institutions, and the actual impunity of elites close to the Kremlin have created a system where corruption has become part of the very power structure. And those who try to speak about it publicly risk being labeled as foreign agents and facing criminal prosecution. That's why the myth that Ukraine is a totally corrupt state should be turned against its authors. Because the Russian Federation is a closed authoritarian kleptocracy, where corruption is not a deviation from the system. It is the system itself. Myth 5. Ukraine is not needed by Europe. It is not needed by Europe, and it will never become a part of the EU. And another idea that was imposed on Ukrainians to demoralize them and slow down European integration. The Kremlin insisted that the EU would never recognize Ukraine as part of the European space. Sergei Lavrov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, constantly pushes the narrative that the EU supposedly uses Ukraine as a buffer zone or as a tool to pressure Russia. Over the years, he has called Ukraine a geopolitical battering ram, a tool to suppress Russia, a pawn of the West, and an irritant in relations between Russia and Europe. After the start of the full-scale invasion, this rhetoric became even more radical. Dmitry Medvedev stated that in 2 years, Ukraine would not exist on the world map at all. What did we see in reality? Ukraine's path to the EU destroyed any doubts about whether Brussels and the European community see Ukraine as part of themselves. In June 2022, Ukraine received official candidate status for membership in the European Union. And since June 2024, official accession negotiations have already been underway. Ukraine is technically integrating into European markets, legislation, and institutions, gradually closing negotiation clusters. The EU Council's statement clearly says, Ukraine is part of our European family. The future of Ukraine and its citizens is in the European Union. At the same time, Ukraine has become part of the EU's strategic policies. The EU has created a special mechanism called the Ukraine Facility. This is not a one-time aid, but long-term support for the recovery, reconstruction, and Ukraine's path to joining the EU for 2024-2027, amounting to up to 50 billion euros. The total amount of assistance to Ukraine from the EU and its member states exceeds 200 billion euros. This is political, financial, economic, humanitarian, military, and diplomatic support. If Europe is not interested in Ukraine, it does not create a multi-year financial instrument tied to reforms and future membership. Decisions in the fields of energy and security are just as telling. In March 2022, the Ukrainian energy system was synchronized with the European NSO-E network, ending its dependence on the Russian energy space. The European Union also established a special mission to train Ukrainian military personnel, effectively joining efforts to strengthen Ukraine's defense capabilities. Integration is taking place not only at the level of state institutions. After 2022, the EU activated the Temporary Protection Mechanism for Ukrainians, which gave millions of Ukrainian citizens the right to legally live, work, study, and access social services in EU countries. Ukrainians themselves have made an unequivocal choice in favor of Europe. According to sociological research, as of 2026, an absolute majority of citizens, 83%, support Ukraine's accession to the EU. More than 60% of Ukrainians believe that in the near future, Ukraine will be a prosperous country within the European family. The statement of the EU Council on the opening of negotiations notes that Ukraine is already a close partner of the EU, and that the association agreement is the basis for broad cooperation, and Ukraine must continue moving towards full alignment with the EU's foreign and security policy. That is, Europe is not just helping a victim of war, it is including Ukraine in its own political horizon. Ukraine has received candidate status, opened accession negotiations, and has become the recipient of the largest support package in the history of EU relations with a partner country. It synchronized its energy system with Europe, joined European programs, and received mechanisms for financing and recovery. The narrative that Russia used to undermine Ukrainians' faith in their own future proved false. In fact, the European Union not only supported Ukraine during the war, but also legally secured its European perspective. The EU does not like to take such steps for those it considers unnecessary. Myth 6. Ukraine is an incapable state. Unnecessary. Myth 6. Ukraine is an incapable state.
Неспроможна Україна.
And one that has always been part of a broader concept of denying the existence of Ukraine as a separate nation. And glory, it came from the Kremlin leadership. And back in 2008, according to participants of the Bucharest NATO summit, Putin told George Bush that Ukraine is not even a state. And in 2022, in an official address just a day before the start of the full-scale invasion, he repeated the same thing.
But modern Ukraine was created entirely and completely by Russia. A stable statehood never emerged in Ukraine.
The word genocide was mentioned again, and the Ukrainian government was called puppets of the West.
Do they realize that their country is not even under political and economic protectorate, but has been reduced to the level of a colony with a barely puppet regime? All of this horror, the genocide that almost 4 million people are subjected to.
Similar narratives were systematically promoted by Russian media. And since April 22, 2022, the state agency RIA Novosti published an article by Timofey Sergeytsev titled, "What Russia Should Do with Ukraine," which spoke not just about Ukraine's incapacity, but about the need for its denazification, de-Ukrainization, and the actual destruction of Ukraine as a state. Reviews describe this article as an example of an open call for the elimination of Ukrainian Ukraine.
Української державності.
The article caused outrage among European politicians. In particular, Bundestag member Thomas Hellmann filed a lawsuit with the Berlin prosecutor's office against the author of the article, as its content violates the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. As always, reality itself provided the main rebuttal to the myth. Ukraine not only preserved its statehood, but also went through several competitive electoral cycles. The 2019 presidential elections, according to the OSCE, were free and ensured respect for fundamental freedoms. And power was peacefully transferred from Petro Poroshenko to Volodymyr Zelensky. Political collapse and the loss of legitimacy of institutions are typical for failed states, not the change of power through democratic elections. The most convincing test was the full-scale war. Despite the Kremlin's calculations, the Ukrainian system of governance remained functional. The president, the government, the parliament, the military command, local authorities and state services continued to operate. In 2024, the parliament carried out the largest government reshuffle since the beginning of the invasion. The Verkhovna Rada dismissed a number of ministers and appointed new candidates. Even if one can criticize the concentration of power or the quality of personnel decisions, the institutions are still functioning, and they have not collapsed. The predictions about a financial collapse did not come true. On the first day of the invasion, the National Bank fixed the exchange rate, restricted currency operations, supported bank liquidity, and essentially prevented a banking panic. Ukraine continued to pay pensions, social assistance, and salaries to public sector employees. Of course, not without the help of partners. Already in March 2022, the World Bank approved an emergency support package for Ukraine worth $723 million, explicitly stating that the funds should help the government provide critical services. Despite the economic downturn, inflation, and destruction, Ukraine's financial system remained operational. In 2023, the IMF approved a 4-year extended fund facility program for Ukraine worth $15.6 billion. This is the first such program in the fund's history for a country engaged in a large-scale war. The IMF does not issue such programs to a government that is unable to implement fiscal and monetary policy and maintain accountability. The Russian thesis about a failed state does not hold up when it comes to the functioning of the law enforcement and anti-corruption systems. The year 2023 was the most productive for anti-corruption agencies. The cases involved high-ranking officials, heads of state enterprises, judges, and deputies. This indicates the presence of accountability mechanisms even during wartime. International assessments also testify to Ukraine's resilience. In the 2024 United Nations e-government ranking, Ukraine is among the group of countries with a high level of digital development. In the Global Innovation Index in 2024, Ukraine remains the 4th most innovative economy in its income group and ranks 60th among 133 countries worldwide. In the Open Data Maturity Ranking in 2025, Ukraine ranked among the European leaders with an open data maturity level of 97.1%, while the average EU indicator was 86%. International analysts call Ukrainian resilience a phenomenon, citing society's average ability to adapt to crises, maintain governance, and keep vital infrastructure running, and that Kyiv would fall in 3 days. to ensure vital infrastructure functions and demonstrate a high level of horizontal self-organization. Myth 7. Kyiv will fall in 3 days. The most vivid Russian expectation about Ukraine's collapse is reflected in the Kremlin's press release: to take Kyiv in 3 days. In 2014, Putin claimed that Russian troops could capture the capital of Ukraine in 2 weeks. Later, the time frame kept getting shorter. Before the full-scale invasion, Russia's plan allowed 10 days, followed by the occupation of Ukraine until August 2022. The rapid capture of the capital was supposed to be the key to the entire scenario. The most compromising evidence is the Russian propaganda template. On February 26, 2022, the third day of the invasion, when RIA Novosti mistakenly published a victory article by Petr Akopov, The Arrival of Russia and the New World, where it was already announced that Ukraine had returned to Russia. The BBC recorded at the time that the Russian state agency quickly deleted this text, but it was saved in time. That is, Moscow was actually preparing a televised image of a quick capitulation, but then was forced to explain the retreat as gestures of goodwill. Instead, Ukraine not only held the capital, but also created its own defense industry during the war. Today, we are already mass-producing drones, artillery and ammunition, naval drones, long-range strike systems, and electronic warfare equipment. After 2022, the Ukrainian defense industry grew from about $1 billion in annual capacity to around $55 billion in potential production by 2026. There is a detailed analysis about the development of the defense industry during the war on our channel, The Price of the State. How did Ukraine create its defense sector?
Індустрію.
The myth that Kyiv would fall in 3 days failed twice. First, militarily, when Kyiv did not fall, and then strategically, when Ukraine transformed from the object of the Russian blitzkrieg into a country that, during the full-scale war, launched its own weapons production. Russia planned a quick capture and dismantling of Ukrainian statehood, but instead got a years-long confrontation with a state that not only survived, but also strengthened its defense industry in industrial defense.
У промислових масштабах.
Conclusion. Yes, the reorientation in Ukraine was painful. Yes, some enterprises lost their markets. Yes, the war caused enormous losses. But the Kremlin's key prediction failed. The Russian Federation tried to convince the world that Ukraine is a failed state doomed to decline, that the Ukrainian economy can only exist as an appendage to the Russian one. Reality proved the opposite. More than 10 years have passed since Russia started. After breaking economic ties and instead of collapsing, Ukraine rebuilt its trade map, reoriented its exports, opened new markets, went through war, and at the same time is moving toward integration with the EU. Breaking away from Russian influence became one of the key mechanisms of Ukraine's economic and political decolonization. And the predictions about economic death without Russia remained right where they belong, in the archives of Kremlin propaganda. What else do you think hasn't come true from Russian information dumps? Write it down. Let's discuss it in the comments. This video is partially funded by a blogger scholarship from the International Renaissance Foundation. Thank you, Grandpa Soros, for giving us some money to counter Russian propaganda. It's nice to be Soroslings. The rest of the amount is covered by our patrons, YouTube sponsors, and donors. Thank you.